Have you ever heard the song Poncho and Lefty? It was a #1 tune in 1983, sung by Merle Haggard and Willie Nelson, but it was written by the legendary Townes Van Zandt. His music can be found in films like The Big Lebowski, and everyone in rock and roll has high praise for him, from Bob Dylan to Waylon Jennings. So why then did Townes Van Zandt live most of his life dead broke in a tiny shack in the woods without electricity or a phone? For years it's been a mystery, but now his son is coming clean with the truth. Everybody tells a slightly different story of the Townes Van Zandt saga. Bob Dylan, Steve Earle, his wife, his manager. It seems everybody has something different to gain and something to lose, so it's hard to figure out what really happened. Did his wife really rob him blind and leave him for dead? Did his manager really suck him dry and stab him in the back? Or was it something else entirely that led him to his doom? Let's look at the people who knew Townes, and we might get something a little like the truth. Our story today involves a ticked-off Bob Dylan, insane practical jokes, and even amputated hands. Looks like this one's going to get crazy, so stick around. If you enjoyed today's video, please give it a thumbs up. Don't amputate it, just click the button. Subscribe to our channel so you never miss a new video. But now, come on and let's go find out.
What happened?
Bob Dylan. Steve Earle once said, Townes Van Zandt was the best songwriter in the whole world, and I'll stand on Bob Dylan's coffee table in my cowboy boots and say that. But did you know Townes had a real-life relationship with Bob that wasn't exactly strong? Now, Bob Dylan was a huge Van Zandt fan, say that 5 times fast, and over the years he begged him to record music with him. But Townes flat out refused, saying he liked Bob's music but not his celebrity. But Dylan would not stop pestering Townes, and eventually they both ended up in Austin at the same time. And Townes was finally persuaded to give a short audience to the most famous songwriter of the 20th century. The famous Austin Drag was shut down because of Bob, so Townes drove his motorhome into a fenced-off area and allowed Bob to listen to him play a few times. Townes was still humble and very funny. When somebody asked him about what Steve Earle said, he said, quote, I've met Bob Dylan's bodyguards, and if Steve Earle thinks he can stand on Bob Dylan's coffee table, he is sadly mistaken. But Van Zandt's relationship with Steve Earle was a bit more complicated. Steve Earle. It wasn't always easy being friends with Townes Van Zandt. The man was kind, talented, and brilliant, and a huge pain in the butt sometimes. Steve Earle, who was close friends with Townes, learned this firsthand. Townes studied poetry in college and was a pretty sharp guy. He once told Steve to read the book War and Peace, which has over 1,200 pages. Steve spent a few months struggling with it and finally finished it. He came back to Townes with a lot of questions, but Townes said he couldn't help him with that because he had not read that book. He just thought Steve should. But it doesn't seem like Steve held much of a grudge, as he wrote Fort Worth Blues about his friend. And he even named his son Justin Townes Earle after the guy. Janine. Townes knocked up his third wife, Janine, when he was still technically married to his second wife. And Townes' mother made him marry her and provide for the kid. And she never went away. Even after they divorced, Townes was devoted to her for the rest of his life. And today, Janine is fighting a crowd of competitors for rights to Townes' legacy and his cash. But some claim Janine took advantage of Townes while he was alive and is trying to keep the gravy train running. But are the allegations true? According to some, Janine coaxed Townes into signing over the publishing rights and recording royalties of his old music, basically all his income. His only possession after that was his 1989 GMC truck. a 1984 Honda Shadow motorcycle, and a boat named Dorothy. And even that wasn't enough for Janine. Whenever he would visit, she ended up with all the money in his pockets. However, Janine tells a very different story. According to her, it was his manager, Kevin Eggers, who took advantage of Townes. She says they only separated so that if Townes did something really stupid, it wouldn't harm his family legally. In fact, she has said, quote, "He wanted to be married again. He begged me, saying we were supposed to be married." And there's certainly some truth to this. The question is how much. Some of Townes' friends claimed that before he died, he was actually planning on marrying a different woman he met at a concert in Germany. Kevin Eggers. According to Janine, the real villain of the TVZ story is Kevin Eggers, Townes Van Zandt's manager and label owner. So is Kevin really the cartoonish bad guy she says he is? Well, he was there through Townes' highest and lowest moments. According to him, quote, "There was both magic and demons in Townes." TVZ wrote Poncho and Lefty while staying at his house in Brooklyn. According to Janine, Kevin took advantage of Townes while he was alive. And he too wants to keep that gravy train running after his death, as Kevin put out 14 entire albums of unreleased music without the permission of his estate. However, Kevin tells a different story. He says he was the only person who would keep recording with TVZ after he pushed everybody else away, and that he just wants to share as much of his music as he can. Okay, so who the heck is telling the truth? We'll have to turn to JT Van Zandt, Townes' first son, to find out. JTVZ. Townes' son, JT, was born in 1965 to his first wife, Fran Peterson. Townes was never the best at being a stable dad, but he did do his best to build a relationship with his boy. For years, JT has stayed quiet about the truth behind his relationship with Dad, but now he is speaking out. JT lived with Mom most of the time, but he'd get to visit Dad pretty frequently. It was always a big change, going from his responsible, rule-following mom to a guy like Townes. But while you couldn't always depend on Townes, JT loved his dad more than anything else in the world. And he said whenever he'd visit, they'd have a great time. JT said, quote, "I always felt like I was the coolest guy in the world. That was when he smelled funky and had this awful old truck that ran half the time, living in a house with no electricity." But JT says most people weren't as good to Townes as he was to him. He says that almost nobody showed up to his funeral. So what does he say about the battle between Janine and Kevin? There's one more piece to the puzzle about Townes' early life that may have doomed him from the start. The missing piece of the puzzle. TVZ was born to a rich family in Fort Worth, Texas. His parents wanted him to become a lawyer or a senator. You know, anything but a rambling singer, that's for sure. But when he saw Elvis on the Ed Sullivan Show, he made up his mind. The music life was the one for him. When Townes went off to college, he had a hard time adapting. He struggled with binge drinking and depression. Not long after, he was diagnosed with bipolar disorder, which can make it tough to live a normal life, but not impossible, with medication and patience. But what his parents did next would forever change the course of his life. They gave him something called insulin shock therapy. You've probably heard of electroshock therapy, the controversial procedure where they zap your brain with electricity. You know, basically One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. It's ugly to watch. Well, insulin shock therapy is very similar, but even more violent. Patients are injected with, you guessed it, insulin. So they basically go into a coma. This was supposed to fix Townes' head, but instead, it basically broke his brain and destroyed his long-term memory. The boy was never the same after that. And I think it explains a lot about Townes' behavior. It explains statements like this. There's been times when my hands, I took them, and I have the feeling, a very strange feeling, that if I had a machine and could just chop my hands off, then everything would be fine. Yikes. With that in mind, it's a miracle that Townes was able to go as far as he did, touch so many people he did. His life, just like his music, is heartbreaking. But Townes Van Zandt teaches us a valuable lesson. It's often the most broken people who have the most to offer. Alright, that's all from me. Now we need to hear from you. What did you know about Townes Van Zandt? Do you have a favorite song he wrote? Who is your favorite folk musician from the 60s and 70s? And which musician off the beaten path should we cover next? Get in the comments and tell me all things Townes Van Zandt and all things folk music. If you enjoyed today's song, please give it a thumbs up. Subscribe to our channel and come back often so we can keep telling you what happened.
What happened?